Well, this is a lecture on Howard Johnson, and it's one of the many books that I've written. I've done 90 books now. My book on the Christmas Tree Shop just came out about a month ago. Now, the whole concept is I like to write on history that we all share. So you might remember the Baker Chocolate Company, S.S. Pierce, Howard Johnson's, Jordan Marsh. And right now I'm writing a book on Wednesday is Prince Spaghetti Day. So I'm sure, like me, you also had macaroni on Wednesday evenings. My mother wasn't Italian, but she actually cajoled my father into believing that she made whatever we served. But the whole concept is the history of Howard Johnson has a great impact on Quincy. Not only was Howard Johnson raised here, but he started his business in Quincy Square. And seen here on the cover, A History of Howard Johnson's How a Massachusetts Soda Fountain Became an American Icon, was written a few years ago to actually chronicle something that was one of the best-known restaurant chains in the United States. It went from Maine to Florida, from the East Coast to the West Coast. And in some ways, everyone above the age of 40 actually remembers Howard Johnson's. So in a lot of ways, when I think about it, I always like to show who he was. And this is Howard Deering Johnson. He was born in Port Norfolk, Dorchester in 1899. And a year later, the family moved to what is today Wollaston. They lived on Belmont Street. And the family during that period of time were typical. They were Canadian as well as Scottish and Swedish immigrants. And in that instance, Howard Johnson himself, who would actually only finish the 8th grade, would be somebody who started a business in 1925 that grew by leaps and bounds. Of course, anybody that serves ice cream would be in my book. But in this instance, he was somebody who not only started a business, but would brand it. And seen here is a watercolor of the original logo of Simple Simon and the Piemen. And of course, what they did was to add a drooling dog, as you can see in the very center. Well, Simple Simon met a pieman going to the fair. Says Simple Simon to the pieman, "Let me taste your ware." Said the pieman to Simple Simon, "Show me first your penny." Says Simple Simon to the pieman, "Indeed, I have not any." Simple Simon went on a fishing for catching a whale. All the water he had got was in his mother's pail. Simple Simon went to look if plums grew on a thistle. He pricked his fingers very much, which made poor Simon whistle. He went for water in a sieve, but soon it all fell through. And now poor Simple Simon bids you all adieu. Well, I'm glad they didn't say adieu, because that was something that would become probably one of the most recognizable logos in the food industry. But Howard Johnson also had a son. This was Howard Brennan Johnson, a son of the 3rd marriage, and there would be 4 marriages in Mr. Johnson's life. In this instance, he realized that not only he started the business in 1925, but his son would eventually sell it in 1989 to a conglomerate in Britain that would actually split apart the company. Well, the story begins in Wollaston, which is a neighborhood of Quincy. Quincy became a municipality in the 1890s, and the population would triple between that time and World War I. But one of the reasons for the actual expansion of the city was accessibility to Boston. And during that period, there had been a branch of the Granite Railway, which actually was the old colony. And seen here at Wollaston, a depot in the very center allowed people to commute to Boston for business and pleasure in the evening. In that instance, we would see in some ways that Quincy's population doubling and then tripling by the 1920s would also need all sorts of different supplies. On the right-hand side was the original Walker Barlow drugstore. This was bought by Howard Johnson in 1925. He took a $2,000 loan from Dr. George Dalton, who was an internist at Quincy City Hospital, and a $300 loan from his widowed mother. And in that instance, he opened a store that would actually encompass not only light lunches as well as breakfast, but it would also have, as we see here, a soda fountain. Well, the soda fountain was 20 feet long, it was made of marble, and not only did they serve effervescent drinks, but of course things such as ice cream sundaes. And during that period, people not only stopping there because they were traveling to Boston, might buy a newspaper, a magazine, cigars, or cigarettes, but many people would stop for a cooling drink. Well, during that period, Howard Johnson did sell ice cream, vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. It was brought in. But in 1926, with the man on the left, Everett Porter, he began to experiment making all-natural ice cream. They bought French freezers, and they began to actually produce all sorts of things that had a variety of flavors. But the problem was the ice cream, though delicious, had shards of ice in it. And we began to realize in some ways he wanted something that was creamy, smooth, and delicious, but he could not achieve it. And in that instance, though they did this over an entire year, they realized that the only person that they could go to was a man by the name of William Hallbauer. Now, Hallbauer was a German immigrant, and seen here, he lived in Nahant, Massachusetts. And in the early part of the 20th century, it was said that he made the best ice cream in the Boston area. His was creamy and smooth, and there was no ice in it. So seen here, just to the right of the doorway, Hallbauer got a wonderful meeting with Howard Johnson. And he said to him, "How do you do it?" Well, he said, "I can actually sell you the recipe." And when he sold the recipe, it didn't differ from his mother's ice cream recipe one iota, except for the fact that he used a 14% butter count. And the butter fat was something in some ways that created the creamy, smooth confection. Well, he said, if Hallbauer uses 14%, I'm going to use 16%. So it was not only the richest, creamiest, smoothest ice cream, it was also the most fattening. Well, in that way, he produced in some ways 28 delicious flavors. This is an advertisement from 1931. The little boy is winking at us with a larger-than-life ice cream cone at 10 cents. But it had 28 flavors, which actually in that instance was to chronicle not only the aspect, but the variety of things, and actually for every palate. It started with vanilla and ended with pineapple, but they also made 5 sherbets. Well, during this period of time, Howard Johnson was selling ice cream by the bucketful in Wollaston. And he decided that during the period of 1927 that they would open a roadside stand at, of course, Wollaston Beach. Now, this postcard from 1915 shows people not only at the beach, but even ladies on the right-hand side in muslin dresses and parasols strolling along the beach. Well, of course, going to the beach, one becomes hungry and thirsty, and Howard Johnson decided that he would rent a small shack adjacent to the beach where he would serve, as we can see here, fried clams, French fries, cool drinks, and Howard Johnson's 28 ice creams. This actually was rented for $300 for the entire summer. Well, Howard Johnson's reputation had already been made at Wollaston. Many people realized that for 10 cents a cone, it really was twice the size of anyone else's, and he would actually have 2 young men scooping on a daily basis, 7 days a week. Well, it was said that the Quincy Police Department had to be called out. Every Saturday and Sunday, there would be thousands of people at the beach with hundreds queuing up to get an ice cream cone. These 2 men couldn't keep up, and in that instance, the police would actually make people wait in line on either side. It was a success, and during that period, a year later, he would actually open stands at both Revere Beach and Nantasket Beach. These ice cream stands were things that were pretty easy to do, but you had to make the ice cream ahead of time, transport it in freezer trucks, and keep it quite frozen. But by 1929, he was doing well enough to actually contemplate a new restaurant. Seen here in Quincy Square, and this is a postcard of 1950, it was very historic. It had the Church of the Presidents on the left-hand side, where John Adams and John Quincy Adams not only worshipped, but are buried in the crypt. And on the right-hand side, Quincy City Hall. But in the distance was the Granite Trust Bank building. It was to be built between 1928 and 1929, and it was the tallest building on the South Shore of Massachusetts. Well, Howard Johnson had always wanted to open a colonial-themed restaurant with colonial-type food. And in that instance, he would approach a man named Theophilus King, who was the president of the State Street Bank and Trust Company. Well, this was an 11-story tower, and of course, it was primarily the bank that occupied it. But on the ground floor on either side of the main entrance would be shops that were rented to offset the cost of operating the building. Well, Howard Johnson in 1929 got a $50,000 line of credit, and he opened the Colonial Room. Not only did it have stools at a counter, but it also had a dining room itself. And in that way, he would begin to serve delicious traditional food. He hired a woman by the name of Virginia Church. Probably nobody has ever heard of her, but she and her husband were living in Boston. He was attending the Harvard Medical School, and she was a trained dietitian. She was hired by the company to create nutritious but also attractive dishes. And she was the one that actually introduced not just roast turkey, but she also did things such as shrimp curries and chicken a la king and different things, including the fried clams. But as a dietitian, I've always wondered what she thought about the 16% butterfat count ice cream. But in that instance, she became quite popular, and she and her husband, and I'm sure you all have one, wrote the Bose and Church Caloric Guide. It's on my refrigerator, and I read it every day when I take things out of the freezer to eat. But in that way, he became quite successful. Now, during the fall of that year, in 1929, granted, he had businessmen's breakfasts, lunches, and dinners at 50 cents a plate, he was somebody who would see a great coup. Because in the fall of 1929, a play called Strange Interlude was being performed on Broadway. This was something that was written by the Pulitzer Prize-winning author Eugene O'Neill, and it was something that was being done by the Theater Guild, and it was going from city to city. Well, it was a little bit outre, and the whole idea was, as I say, the plot centers on a woman by the name of Nina Leeds, the daughter of a classics professor at a college in New England, who is devastated when her adored fiancé is killed in World War I. Nina embarks on a series of sordid affairs before determining to marry Sam Evans. And while Nina is pregnant with Sam's child, she learns a horrifying secret known only to Sam's mother. Insanity runs in the Evans family and could be inherited by any child of Sam's. Well, realizing that a child is essential to her own and to Sam's happiness, she decides to abort Sam's child and conceive a child with the physician Ned Darrow, letting Sam believe that it is his. The plan backfires when Nina and Ned's intimacy leads to their falling passionately in love. It sounds like a soap opera, and it was. But Strange Interlude was in New York, and it was supposed to come to Boston to be performed in early September 1929. Well, Malcolm Nichols, who was the mayor of the city of Boston, decided to go to New York. And he went to Strange Interlude, and the moment he returned to his hotel, he called the Watch and Ward Society in Boston. And the play was banned in Boston. Well, the Theater Guild had already sold advance tickets, which they said they weren't going to refund any money. And they began to call every theater, hall, and auditorium in and around Boston, and everyone refused them. They were banned. But the idea was there was only one place that allowed them to perform, and that was on the right-hand side, the Quincy Theater. So if you know anybody, and you all live in Quincy, that lives in Quincy, they're a little less moral than the rest of us. Well, in that instance, this was something that would open on the second week of September 1929. Strange Interlude was a popular play, but it was 6.5 hours long. They didn't have an intermission, they had a dinner break. People came out from Boston on the Old Colony Granite Branch line to Quincy dinner jackets and evening gowns, and the only place within walking distance was Howard Johnson's restaurant. And you can see it just to the left of the entrance. Well, his 50-cent businessman's dinners went up to $1.50, and he was raking in the money. The play was very popular. Anything that is banned actually creates comment and, of course, attraction. But the whole idea was it had a very good run of 5 weeks. And when it closed in November of 1929, Black Friday occurred, and the stock market crashed. And in that way, many people began to realize that not only was Howard Johnson's restaurant something that was an extravagance, few people had money to actually go out to dinner, let alone a dime for an ice cream cone. And Howard Johnson, during that period, who had a widowed mother and at that time a wife and 2 unmarried sisters to support, realized that he had to do something. Well, his best friend was Reginald Heber Sprague, who lived in Wollaston, and he began to discuss with him the travails of trying to keep this business operating. Very few people could actually dine out, and the idea here was that he had a father, Captain Sprague, that lived in Orleans. So they went to visit him. And Captain Sprague, a retired sea captain, was a very common-sense person, and they began to realize that Howard Johnson's was a very popular place. But the whole idea was that in some instances, if they franchised it and opened another restaurant, they might do well on Cape Cod. Well, in that instance, in 1935, a new restaurant was opened in Orleans, and this was at the junction of Route 6A and Route 28. The building, which actually had an orange roof and turquoise blue shutters, was the idea of a man named John Alcott, who was a graphic designer. He not only created the logo of Simple Simon and the Piemen, but he also created the font as well as the color scheme. I don't think any of us could ever miss an orange roof and blue shutters. But in this way, this was only open 9 months out of the year. Many people on Cape Cod would summer, but most people year-round wouldn't go out during the winter months. Well, this became the first restaurant franchise in America, and Howard Johnson is credited as being the father of the franchise industry. But these were a little bit more than just a restaurant. They were controlled by Howard Johnson so that the food and ice cream was provided through the commissary in Wollaston. And nobody could serve anything other than Howard Johnson food, drink, and ice cream. Well, it became so popular that within months, one opened in Dorchester. It was on Old Colony Parkway, or what we call Morrissey Boulevard today. And the building, like the one in Orleans, had an orange roof, but it was adjacent to the Neponset Rotary. It was a major part of the development of that area. Now, we're all too young to remember, but Old Colony Parkway was the only way into or out of Boston before the Southeast Expressway. So you had to pass this restaurant. And not only with an orange roof during the day, but the marquee that was actually lit with neon lights in the evening, it was easily accessible. It also had parking. So Howard Johnson was beginning to cater not just to the traveling public, but businessmen and people who wanted something quick, either at the counter or lunch or dinner at the restaurant. This one opened at Wellington Circle in Medford in 1937. And as you can see, each of these buildings were colonial revival in theme, and he had architects on staff that would work with the person who had bought the land to actually design a new restaurant. Well, in that way, not only did you see here a rotary, but it was actually to have roads that went in 4 different directions, one to Charlestown and Boston, another to Somerville and Medford, Medford and Stoneham, and of course Chelsea and Everett. This was a major feature, and in the 1930s, Howard Johnson's colonial revival roadside stands, and this is Howard Johnson in front of the one on Canton on Route 138 on the Milton line, you began to realize they were attractive buildings. White clapboard, orange tile roof, which were provided by Norman Pemberton of Quincy, Massachusetts, as well as a cupola with a light within and a weather vane of the Simple Simon and the Pieman and the Drooling Dog. They all came with parking. And during this period, with the ascendancy of the automobile, it became an important place where people would stop. But during that period, they were able in some ways to coin the aspect of that logo. And seen on the right-hand side, which is a detail of a swizzle stick that I have showing Simple Simon, the Pieman, and the Drooling Dog, and it's in orange, was something in some ways that would be used as well as dinner plates, cups and saucers, placemats. Everything was embossed with the logo. And it was thanks to John Eagles Olcott. Olcott not only was a graduate of RISD in Rhode Island, but he was also somebody who taught graphic design in Everett Public Schools. He was somebody as a graphic designer that had 150 different clients in the 1930s. Many people wanted something simple for their business. But Howard Johnson met with him, and the idea was that on Howard Johnson's desk was a tin of boiled candy. And the tin had Simple Simon on all four sides. And by the addition of the Drooling Dog, it could have been me drooling for the ice cream, they realized that was the logo. And it became something that was synonymous with Howard Johnson. But during this period of time, Howard Johnson had some pretty interesting friends. Does anybody recognize this woman? Well, her name was Sister Parish. And Sister Parish had grown up very wealthy. She married a very wealthy man. But the problem was the Depression hard hit them, and she had to go to work. Well, she had never worked in her life. What was she going to do? So she decided she would do interior decoration for her friends who weren't as poor as she was. And she became a renowned interior decorator, and Sister Parish would later become known as Parish Hoadley. They even did the White House. And seen here in a photograph of the 1940s, she recouped her wealth. And of course, Howard Johnson had asked her if she would assist him. She had great style and panache, and Howard Johnson asked her, "Would you design a waitress uniform for me?" And she did. It was actually teal green with a white apron, caps, and cuff. And Howard Johnson was excited. He said, "It's wonderful." And after she presented the final design, he said, "What do I owe you, sister?" And she said, "Nothing, but I'll take a lifetime supply of ice cream." Well, the 28 flavors could actually fill her freezer, and thankfully she did have a freezer now that she had become successful. But the idea was in that instance that people would assist Howard Johnson. I think a lot of people realized he wasn't just a good friend, but he was also somebody who supported these friends in their businesses. Well, here, not only do we see an interior photograph of a restaurant, two waitresses on either side of a banquette, but if you look at the walls, they're wide plank knotty pine paneling. And in that instance, his friend Frank Curry had a woodworking company in Boston South End. And Frank Curry and Company would provide all of the interior remodeling for each individual store. And of course, Norman Pemberton of Pemberton Roofing of Quincy became the man who provided all of the orange roofs. In that way, a waitress on the lower right-hand side holds a menu that not only had the standard fare, much of which was devised by Virginia Church, but it was also to have daily specials. And people came to realize, whether you were in Portland, Maine, Quincy, Massachusetts, or Miami, Florida, the food was consistent. It was always delicious, always cooked the same way. And Howard Johnson realized in that instance that not only did people want something that was sensibly priced, and of course delicious, they also wanted a place where they could get a quick cup of coffee or even a piece of pie. Well, seen on the left-hand side, this was the counter with the booze. Yes, you could have a lunch there, but a lot of people just stopped for a little bit of a break and the clean facilities while they were on the road. And on the right-hand side is something that I have in my basement, lollipops for good little boys and girls. I don't know why it was ever given to me. I was never a good boy. But in that instance, it was something that for some reason my aunt had secured. I don't know why. But the idea here was that adults liked it, young adults, teenagers, and children. There was something for everyone. But here in a photograph from 1941 from Fortune magazine, Howard Johnson's famous 28 flavors had become known across the country. This young boy actually scoops from the freezer holding 4 sugar cones in his hand, and the different flavors are alphabetical: apple, fruit salad, ginger, peanut brittle, and vanilla. But the idea was the vanilla was the preponderance of the flavor people usually chose. It's my favorite, but I like Jimmy's on it. So you began to realize that not only were people locally, such as Wollaston and Quincy, enjoying this, but it was being enjoyed across the country. Well, John Alcott, the graphic designer, also did full-page color advertisements in nationwide magazines. Look and Life magazine would have these entire things. And of course, the young man behind the counter holds a scoop. Now, the idea is, you can see on the right-hand side, this scoop was specially designed for Howard Johnson. It was pyramidal with the top cut off. So when the ice cream was scooped, and you had to realize it was very creamy as well because air was beat into the ice cream, it would create not only a huge helping, but a throat of the ice cream. And these children on either side, on the left-hand side, stare at the billboard with 28 flavors. It says, "The wonderful world of 28 flavors of Howard Johnson's." Well, these weren't just any children, they were Howard Johnson's. And you began to realize that they were used in the advertisements as early as the late 1930s, early 1940s. And you would see them here: Dorothy, the daughter of the second marriage; on the right, Howard, the son of the third marriage, and his nephew Timmy on the left-hand side. Well, I would smile if somebody gave me an ice cream sundae, an ice cream float, or even an ice cream cone. But it says everything's better than make-believe at Howard Johnson's. Well, these children were an important part of Howard Johnson's life. As I mentioned, he was married 4 times. The first marriage ended in divorce. His wife said, "I feel like I've been deserted." But he admitted he worked 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I think we'd probably feel deserted as well. The second marriage, unfortunately, the wife died shortly after childbirth. The third marriage ended in divorce. And the fourth one outlived him. But in this way, you saw the children used not just in magazine advertisements, but in billboards. And you would see these billboards on the major highways, and the children are smiling with an ice cream cone. "We love our daddy's ice cream, and so too won't you." And that advertisement began to make Howard Johnson a very wealthy man. Well, in this photograph from 1937, he bought a house on Summit Avenue in Wollaston. Big house, 6 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, 1/4 of an acre of land, but the view to Boston was superb. He's walking down the steps at this time because he was now secure after having divorced his third wife. He got his children in the divorce, which sounds peculiar, but on the other hand, you realize that these children were everything to him. On the left-hand side was Dorothy, and on the right, Howard. They're sitting in the living room of that house on Summit Avenue, and he's reading to them the history of Howard Johnson's. Now, the company was only founded in 1925. I don't know how much happened over 12 years, but I have a copy of this, and it was triple-spaced for 3 pages to tell you everything he did in 12 years. The other 37 pages were every listing of ice cream stands and restaurants across the United States. By 1937, he was grossing $1 million a year. And you had to realize that was still during the Great Depression. And in that way, not only did he have his children, but he decided in that instance that he was going to move. And he decided that he would move to Milton. The building he bought was the old N. Penrose Hallowell Mansion on Brush Hill Road. Hallowell was a financier in Boston, and he lived in Back Bay, but he also kept a place on Park Avenue in New York. The reason he built this was his children were going to Milton Academy. and he wanted them to come home for the weekend so they could have their own bed and hot meals. Sounds like a good father. Well, this was a building that was 8 bedrooms, 10 bathrooms, 14 acres of land, an 8-car garage, tennis courts, and it was something that was so grand that in the 1940 street directory of Milton, he lived there with a butler, a housekeeper, a cook, 2 live-in maids, and a chauffeur. But he lived there all by himself. The son boarded at Phillips Andover and the daughter at Dana Hall. So he bought this not so much to live in, but to use it as a business prop. It was a very exclusive area, as it still is. Brush Hill is lovely. But the idea was he bought this to begin to entertain people. Now, the people he would entertain are possible franchisees who would buy a franchise to open a restaurant. He erected marquees, and you can see the edge of the marquee on the upper left-hand side on the back lawn. And the marquee would be bigger than this room that could hold 400 people. And he decided to invite people to what was called a Frankfurter roast. The only food served was a grilled Frankfurter in a toasted bun and creamery butter. But in the 4 corners of the tent was an open bar, and you were invited to enjoy yourself. Well, the whole idea was people would come with their husband or wife or friend, and seen in that instance in this photograph, Howard Johnson is the host in the very center. Well, people did buy franchises, and they averaged at that time $4,000. Sounds like nothing today. But in 1940, $4,000 bought a very nice house. On the left-hand side was Irving Cotter. He was from Fairfield, Connecticut, and he bought a franchise, and he was running it as late as 1971 on Route 95 in Fairfield. But you see the man on the right with his hands in front of him? His name was George Lawson, and he was from Wellesley. And he did buy a franchise and opened it in Wellesley Square. But the problem was he was stymied. He could only serve the food and ice cream that came from Howard Johnson's commissaries. The problem was, even if Aunt Maud made the best coconut cake you'd ever tasted, you couldn't serve it. He actually decided to sell the franchise back to Howard Johnson. And he was obviously a very good businessman because he opened the Pillar House restaurant on Route 128. So many of these people not only had $4,000 or had the ability to be borrowing $4,000, but they began to realize that Howard Johnson franchises were just incredible. Well, in 1940, Fortune magazine had done an article, and the article title was, "Who is Howard Johnson?" Everyone knew the name from the restaurant, but was it really a person? Well, they did an 18-page article with beautiful color photographs as well as black and white. This disembodied hand holds a chocolate ice cream, and it said, "The Boss, it's my favorite." Well, I like chocolate ice cream. I don't buy it too often because the dog can't have it, so we usually have vanilla. But in this instance, this wasn't just any chocolate ice cream. This was Howard Johnson's, made with real Belgian fudge and 16% butterfat count. It was the best on the market. And people realized that this Fortune magazine article was read by people across the country. They couldn't understand how Howard Johnson could be so successful during the Depression. And seen here was a photograph of a statistician on the right-hand side. He taught a course on statistics. But one of the things he also did was to encourage young men and women, because there were at least 15 to 20% women who bought franchises, to actually make up a luncheon or a dinner plate. It was part of the training. They would attend what I call the Howard Johnson Institute. It was for 8 weeks, 40 hours a week, and it taught you not only, not only how to run a business, but also to ensure a profit. Now, if we were making up a plate, I don't know about you, but I might want fried clams, French fries, coleslaw, rolls, and butter. And of course, dessert. In that instance, you would make up the plate, which you were going to eat anyway. But if there were too many French fries, too many clams, and of course a little bit too much tapioca pudding, you were cutting into profits. And if you did that repetitively every day, at the end of the month, it would actually reflected in your profit. Howard Johnson would always say to people, put the parsley on the plate first and then fill it in. And at least it took up 10% of the plate. Well, by 1939, Howard Johnson was known not only for his restaurants, but he decided to build what he called the largest roadside restaurant in the United States. This was to actually be opened in Rego Park, New York, which is Jamaica. And you realized it was actually built because the New York World's Fair was to actually be opened in 1939 and held for 2 years. In that way, people looked at this not only as the largest restaurant in the world, it could seat 1,100 people at any given time. It was open from 5 in the morning until 1 a.m., but it also had the largest orange roof in the world, and that was in the Guinness Book of World Records. Well, if you were going to the World's Fair, you had to pass by this building. So whether you were on foot, bicycle, automobile, bus, it was something that not only could you stop at, but you could actually have the same food that you had here in Quincy. Well, with the estimation that there were going to be millions of people at the New York World's Fair, he needed somebody to co-invest in the company, because the building and land was going to cost $600,000, which was a huge sum of money. Very few people had that kind of money to invest, but this woman did. Her name was Lydia Gove. Has anybody ever heard of her? Well, Lydia Gove had attended Smith, and then she attended Radcliffe, and she was treasurer of her grandmother's business called the Lydia Pinkham Medicine Company. Now, during that period, she was making $300,000 a year as treasurer of the company. Her father, who had gone both to Harvard and Harvard Law School, was making $500,000 a year. But she was somebody who had affluence, and seen here, she was a great aviatrix as well. But she decided that she would actually invest her money in Howard Johnson. Well, I love it on the left-hand side, Lydia Pinkham's Vegetable Compound. Look at that. Men love peppy girls, and she looks great. But in the early 1870s, the patent medicine entrepreneur Lydia Estes Pinkham developed a mixture of black cohosh, pleurisy root, fungique, and other herbs, plus a measure of 40-proof drinking alcohol, and sold it under the name Lydia E. Pinkham's Vegetable Compound. The women who bought it sought not only pep, but also relief from menstrual cramps, headaches, nervousness, hot flashes, depression, symptoms of menopause, and other female complaints. Well, because it had alcohol, it probably would have cured every male ailment as well. But this survived FDA scrutiny, and in 1922, the average sale of Lydia Pinkham's Vegetable Compound was over $10 million a year. It was incredible. So she decided with Howard Johnson to invest $300,000 each, and here on opening night, not only was Howard Johnson in the center in white tie and tails, all of the other gentlemen are in black tie, but Lydia Pinkham is just to the left, Lydia Pinkham Gove, just to the left, dripping in emeralds. They invited their family and friends, and everybody had a great time because there was, again, an open bar in every corner of the restaurant. But when they sat to dinner, they ordered from the menu. And some restaurants might offer lobster tails or filet mignon or prime rib, as this restaurant did. And people began to realize that this was a restaurant that appealed to everyone. It didn't matter who you were. The food was good and sensibly priced. People began to realize in some ways that this one restaurant would actually have great panache. And this was a coin that they minted just for the Rego Park restaurant. It was a circular coin about the size of a silver dollar, and it said New York World's Fair 1939. And you can see the buildings that were actually at the fair. On the obverse was Simple Simon and the Pieman and the Drooling Dog. Now, the coin had no numerical value whatsoever, but if you had that coin and you stopped at the Rego Park restaurant, you got 10% off whatever you enjoyed. Now, the idea was 10% at dinner, and of course everybody's was covered, would be something that was really quite an attraction. Well, this coin had a 7 million turn each of the 2 years. So you can imagine at 10% what they were raking in as a gross profit. It was incredible. But it also had the largest neon sign in the world. And this showed at 28 feet Howard Johnson's ice cream, 28 flavors. They had a grill, cocktail lounge, special luncheons, steak, chops, chicken, fried clams, and special frankfurters. These weren't hot dogs. These were 100% beef frankfurts, grilled in creamery butter and served in a toasted bun. People loved Howard Johnson. And the whole idea was they did pop up like magic across the country. This is Somerville, New Jersey, and as you can see, it's actually on a highway that leads to Trenton for 7 miles or New York 63 miles. But again, it was the typical colonial revival restaurant, complacent, traditional, and good food. Howard Johnson during that period would also begin to open up restaurants on Cape Cod. And seen here at the Bourne Bridge, built between 1933 and 1935, he bought the land adjacent to it, as he did at the Sagamore as well. But he only built the one restaurant in Bourne, and it was a little larger than most. So if you were going to Cape Cod, what a wonderful place to stop to have clams and French fries, or baked haddock. It was also a place that you could actually stop on the way to Boston after your vacation on the Cape. But during that period, many people said that this was America's choice. And the waitress, with her wonderful badges of merit, you can see them buttons of the Simple Simon and the Pieman logo, was somebody who would hold up a menu that actually showed delicious food, but also the daily specials. Everyone looked at Howard Johnson's as something that not only adults liked, but even children. And in 1937, Howard Johnson created the first menu for children. Now this is fun. It's just a small little brochure, and we see Simple Simon and the Pieman and the Drooling Dog. But the child could open it and choose something for lunch or dinner. Well, why not a Howard Johnson's grilled frankfurt on a toasted roll, potato chips, baked beans, ice cream, and a beverage, 80 cents. There was also the Tommy Tucker plate, sliced roast beef, fresh vegetables, mashed potato and gravy, rolls and butter and ice cream for $1. But you could also have breakfast with Simple Simon. They had the Pieman, Three Bears Bait, Jack Sprat's plate, and of course Mrs. Sprat's plate, which was orange juice, a boiled or poached egg in a cup, a strip of bacon, and butter toasted with chocolate or milk for 60 cents. Children loved it because they had their own special menu. Parents loved it because it was actually child size in portion and child size in price. But during the 1960s, Howard Johnson continued the theme for children, and this was a piece of cardboard that was cut that after the child had actually ordered what he or she wanted, this was called the Big League Mail, that included not only the Tommy Tucker plate, but also a hamburger, they could place this on their head to actually have a baseball cap. It was fun, and it was a great collectible. But you also went for breakfast, and many children, after they had placed their order for pancakes, waffles, or a variety of things, with the aid of twine or yarn, could place this on their face and become Mr. Pancake Face. It had sausages for hair, and of course the face looked just like a pancake. Then they could either entertain their family or torture the people in the next banquet. But the children had the ability in some instances to realize that this was a special place just for them. And Howard Johnson's own children enjoyed it as well. Seen here in a detail of a much larger advertisement from Look magazine. Howard Johnson hands an ice cream cone to his daughter Dorothy. Dorothy was always beautifully dressed, her hair beautifully combed. She always smiled politely. But I think the son got the wrong flavor ice cream cone. You began to see in some ways that he brought them as often as he could on Sundays after church to actually enjoy a breakfast with him at the restaurants. But during the period of the 50s and 60s, John Alcott was getting well known. He had many clients, but Howard Johnson was his biggest graphic design client. He did this and he said, Howard Johnson's is haven for the folks, heaven for the kids. And the children come on foot, by scooter, pogo stick, walking stick, and even perambulator. They arrived at the orange roof with their own menu. You also began to see young teenagers, so difficult, would actually enjoy it. And a young woman is seated in this jalopy. She's applying her makeup and she says, you men are all alike. Last night it was frankfurts and fried clams. And the boy on the right says, and those prices look good for my money too. But the boy on the floor actually is painting the 28 flavors of ice cream on his automobile. But the boy with his arm on the hood of the car says, what a dish, 28 flavors. In that instance, an ice cream dish comes to mind, but I think he's looking at the dish in the automobile. There was also young married couples, and in the 1950s we realized our parents were very different. The bride says to the groom, can't you think of anything but 28 flavors? And the groom says, nothing except those frankfurters and fried clams, the hurry-up service and sensible prices. Well, even though it says just married, this couple is a little bit different. And of course, a few years later, after mother and father have had 3 children, I love father with his receding hairline and his decreasing hat. He says as they approach, 28 flavors, 28 flavors, 28 flavors. That's all I ever hear. And the little boy in the back seat says, and don't forget the frankfurters and fried clams, Pop, or those piggyback prices. Well, I heard a little chuckle. These wonderful advertisements would make you smile or chuckle, and that translated into sales, and people went in droves. It didn't matter if you just had an ice cream cone, but many people enjoyed a full meal. And people looked at Howard Johnson's as a place that was a destination. But one of their biggest advertising coups was to have this. Now look at the colors. I'm colorblind, but I can see those colors. It says, Howard Johnson wishes you a happy birthday and invites you to a birthday dinner. Well, they encourage people, mother, father, grandparents, aunts, and uncles, to submit children's names and addresses under the age of 12. And a couple of weeks before their birthday, they received this in the mail, inviting them to a birthday dinner at Howard Johnson. Can you imagine being 12 years of age and being invited to parties? Well, not only did you get a dinner free of charge, you had a birthday cake, ice cream, balloons, lollipops, and birthday hats. The proviso was you had to be accompanied by an adult, and it had to be Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, the slow nights. Well, you can imagine no child was going to go without both parents, all 4 grandparents, aunts, uncles, and siblings. And it was said that during this time, the average was 11 people at every birthday dinner, and it had a 63% turn. Well, in many ways, people looked at it, but on the back of every one of these cards, it said, to our patrons, we desire to maintain and as far as possible to improve on our high standard of food and service. The entire satisfaction of our patrons is of vital importance, and your opinion will be a helpful guide. Comments or suggestions concerning any item of our food or service will be gratefully received. So if you didn't like the meal, maybe the scallops were overdone, maybe there weren't enough clams, or maybe, in some ways, you just wanted to commend the waitress, if you called Howard Johnson's or sent them a note, he would return the call himself. And in that instance, if you had a complaint that sounded feasible, he sent you 6 vouchers for 6 free meals, thanking you for actually taking the time to improve his business. It's almost unheard of to this day. But you realized in some ways some of the foods he served became iconic. Howard Johnson's famous fried clams, and of course a plate, golden brown fried Ipswich clams, delicious French fried potatoes, tartar sauce, hot rolls and butter for 50 cents. I'll take 2. Well, in this instance, these were Ipswich clams, and they were something that was served, as you can see here, in a small tin that allowed you not only to have a napkin, but also the sauce. These were dredged in Ipswich, Massachusetts, and I never realized the Ipswich River was as big as it was. But this was something that was done by the Safran brothers. These were 4 brothers that had come from Kalamata in Greece. And in the teens of the 20th century, they and their parents arrived in the New World. The parents worked in the hosiery industry, which actually was a big industry in Ipswich. But the boys went into dredging clams. They opened clam shucking shacks, with many of the women shucking clams that didn't speak English. They, too, were Greek immigrants, but they were paid according to the weight of the clams they shucked. And once they were shucked, they were brought to George Safran, the eldest brother and the brains of the business. He would then wash them and place them into 1-gallon tins of Howard Johnson's, where they'd be taken by biplane from Ipswich to the various commissaries. Now, the commissaries were here in Wollaston, Taunton, Brockton, and Rego Park, New York. Well, in this instance, the Safran brothers would have a contract for 36 years to be the sole purveyors of clams for Howard Johnson. Problem was, the Ipswich River was just so big, and people began to realize in some ways they were delicious. And seen here, this clam strip, which actually is again a toasted roll, was something that many people would order. But by the late 1950s, they were unable to provide as many clams as Howard Johnson required. So at that period, they began to expand, and they began to acquire hen clams from Digby, Nova Scotia, all the way to Hilton Head, South Carolina. And what they were larger-than-life clams cut into strips and fried like a regular full-belly clam. These were the first clam strips served in the United States, and they were patented in 1951. So seen here on the right was George Safran. He sold the name Tender Sweet to Howard Johnson, this is the son, for $10,000. And he realized that a Tender Sweet fried clam plate was very different than the full-belly clams, and many people have different opinions. But clam was important, but so too wasn't turkey. During the period of the 1930s, Howard Johnson required every franchise to serve 6 freshly roasted turkeys daily. And seen here, it says, take a tip from Rudy Valley. How to succeed in carving a turkey without really trying. Well, number 1, put the family in the car. Number 2, head for the orange roof. And number 3, order Howard Johnson's turkey special. Well, at $1.49, this was freshly carved turkey, real mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, gravy, peas and carrots, and rolls and butter. It was almost as good as if it was made at home. So these were 2 of the major things always available on the menu. But they continued in some ways to make people realize that Howard Johnson's was a family-friendly restaurant. And these children's menus, dating from the 1960s and 1970s, would go the gamut. The history of ancient Egypt, the history of Native Americans, the history of the rocket science industry. And they would actually have stories as well as the menu. Once the child had placed his or her order, they could then look at all of these things that had puzzles and a fun book and games, including this page. It shows the little boy at the bottom, and it says, try to print these numbered letters in the like-numbered squares below. So if number 7 is a Q, number 4 is a U, and number 9 is an A, the child, if he or she spelt it correctly, would spell quality. Well, the child was happy they had done it correctly, but it wasn't lost on the parents or grandparents that Howard Johnson's food was quality food. These were great things that kept the child engaged. But on the back of every one of these little booklets was a game that everyone wanted to play, and it was called Howard Johnson's Ice Cream Game. It says check the popular flavors as you try them. Well, all 28 flavors were there with a few extra lines. And the reason was that if you had every box checked, you got a free ice cream cone. Can you imagine the children of Quincy wanting to play this game 3 or 4 times a day in July, August, and September? I'd want to. But the whole idea was Howard Johnson, seen here, and this is in 1959 at the Southeast Expressway restaurant at Boston Street in Dorchester, had built up this company from a debt of $2,300 to a valuation of $750 million. He sees, in this instance, his logo, and you realize that he handed the business to his only son. Now, unlike the father who had dropped out of school in the 8th grade, the son was educated at Moses Brown, Milton Academy, Phillips Andover, Yale, and the Harvard Business School. So he should have been well equipped to run a multi-million-dollar company. He said, I started at the top and I worked my way down. It gives you a little bit of an idea how conceited he was. But one of the things he did that was really quite good is he placed the company onto the New York Stock Exchange. So if we liked it, we might buy a share of stock or maybe even a block. And the stock sold between 1960 and 1972 when the founder died. The family sold $1 billion worth of stock. Now that's the 1960s and 70s, so it'd be the equivalent today of about $15 billion. People invested in it because it declared a dividend quarterly without fail. He also streamlined the restaurants, and no longer were they colonial revival. He hired Rudolph Nims, seen on the lower left, an Atlanta-based architect, to create a modern restaurant. It had plate glass windows with a counter and stools on the right, a dining room on the left, and the kitchen and facilities in the very center. It still had an orange roof and ample parking, but it was something that was then used throughout that period that cut costs immensely. He also spent money foolishly. And seen here in a photograph of 1966, he decided to update Sister Parish's waitress uniforms. Now, Sister Parish was still eating her ice cream. You can imagine she lived until 1989. But in this instance, he didn't go to a local purveyor. He went to the House of Dior in Paris. The campaign cost $25,000, and you can see the different uniforms that he asked his waitresses to vote upon. I'd rather they would think that they might want a raise and not wearing haute couture. But you can see here at the Asbury Park, New Jersey, this is the final waitress uniform that was decided upon. And it says, Dior has designed a new uniform for Johnson girls. Well, it was something that was quite nice, but he did spend money hand over fist. He also didn't actually campaign very well. He didn't like competition. And one of the companies that he bought out was called the Red Coach Grill. Do you remember the Red Coach? The best steaks and seafood. It was a wonderful place, and their logo was a stagecoach, seen on the upper left, and a red roof. Well, rather than compete against them, he bought them out. And he also bought out Mug and Muffin, which was something that never really would have competed against Howard Johnson. But as a result, by doing this, he caused a cash flow problem, and many times the company itself was suffering because he wasn't reinvesting in the business. He also would actually continue the expansion of the motel chain that his father had started in 1952. This is Savannah, Georgia. It was built adjacent to a restaurant, very convenient for people traveling to the south, especially to Florida. And you saw in that instance that the company was growing, but that he was not reinvesting in that business. But it did really bring people of all walks of life. Does anybody recognize this woman? I think she's I think I saw her in one of the rooms the other day. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, and she's seen at the Hyannis Rotary restaurant, leaving the all-you-could-eat fish fry for $1.99. Ethel Kennedy is on the left-hand side. Whether she had a cup of coffee or lunch, whatever it was, it began to show in some ways. People of all walks of life loved Howard Johnson. And at $1.35 in this advertisement that dates to 1960, every Wednesday, all day, all-you-can-eat fish fry. A wonderful thing, especially if one had 5 children. Well, in some ways, Howard Johnson's famous 28 flavors became iconic. Everything available for the palate. We might like lemon or macaroon, chocolate chip, coconut, coffee. Each one of them were absolutely delicious. Creamy, smooth, delicious. And we realized in that instance that even here in 1972, Howard Deering Johnson and his son Howard Brennan Johnson share a scoop of vanilla ice cream as they dedicate a plaque to the site of the first Howard Johnson store, opened by Howard D. Johnson on September 3, 1925. This commemorative marker was erected by Howard Johnson through the courtesy of the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority and the city of Quincy on January 11, 1972. In that way, people realized that Howard Johnson was more than a roadside restaurant. Yes, it was a major chain of restaurants that crossed not only from the East Coast to the West, from Maine to Florida, but it was also something in some ways that each one of us at one time or another patronized. And I like to think of it as something that is a delicious memory from the past. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.